My name is Ron Harmon, and I'm joined today by Carla Nilsson, Andrew Nilsson, Emily Nilsson, and Mike Bassinet. And I want to tell you a little bit about their roles in the Tuality congregation. And the Tuality congregation is in the Greater Pacific Northwest Mission Center, and they are a participant in leading congregations in mission. Carla Nilsson will be this fall becoming a part of the pastor leadership team, and so she'll be providing us a congregational perspective today. And Andrew and Emily Nilsson will be providing us the perspective of two individuals that have provided an important role on the pastor leadership team with leading congregations in mission. And Mike Bassinet serves as the congregational support minister and also serves as the mission coordinator for the Greater Pacific Northwest Mission Center. We're going to talk a little bit today about missional practices. And in leading congregations in mission, missional practices have been central to living into some new ways and understandings of how we embody and live Christ's mission in the world today. Several things about missional practices that we want to remind ourselves about today. One is that missional practices are repetitive. So the nature of a practice is that it's something that we commit to on a repetitive basis over a period of time. And it may feel a little bit awkward at first, but then over time it becomes a natural extension of who we are. And so missional practices in leading congregations in mission are about living into some new ways that help us to deepen our relationships with God, with others, and with our neighbors. And in the process, to become Christ's presence of invitation, hospitality, and healing. So Tuality congregations had some experience with the three shared missional practices of LCM, which are the mission prayer, dwelling in the Word, and sharing in the round. And so we'd like to start out by talking just a little bit about the pastor leadership team at Tuality, and what has their experience been with the missional practices? How have they shaped what you do? What have been some challenges as you've sought to engage in the missional practices at Tuality?
Sure. I think for us overall, it's, to be honest, been a process. At the first retreat, we were encouraged to spend equal time in our monthly meetings on the missional practices and on the agenda of running a congregation. And we met that with excitement, but it turned out to be pretty difficult to implement in our first few meetings. We had a great spirit that we cultivated during the first half hour, 45 minutes of the meeting, but it soon led into a lot of stress as we tried to hurry through all the agenda points that we wanted to get covered. So in a way, I don't know if you felt this way, but it almost negated the spirit, the missional practice, all that good energy we built up as a group. So, but we worked with it, and as focusing on the missional practice and making that a priority really forced us to kind of change how we talked about the agenda and try to streamline those processes a little more.
Well, and for a little background, our pastor leadership team came into leadership at a very interesting time. It really just intersected with LCM. So Andrew and I and a couple other members of our LCM team were not a part of the pastorate. Mm-hmm. And right as LCM was beginning for our congregation, we became the pastorate, and our congregation voted for us to become that. So it wasn't even just that the missional practices were new for us. Doing leadership at all was new to us. So we didn't know how to have a meeting or how to run agenda together. That was all new. And then on top of that, the missional practices were new. So we came in with that enthusiasm, but then didn't know how to get all of the things done that we felt that we needed to get done. So our first couple meetings were were pretty difficult and pretty tense
Long.
and really
Yeah,
long.
really
Oh, so
Right.
long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we almost reached a point of, we did reach a point where we talked about, is this even possible? Can we continue to devote half of our time to these shared missional practices and half of our time to what we felt, and I think what we called it at the time, our responsibilities as pastors? Is that fair? But we were being invited by LCM to continue to live with that and to continue to try. So we did. And what ended up happening is we found different ways to deal with the things that we felt were our responsibilities as pastor. And slowly this shift, I think, happened to where the missional practices became our responsibilities as pastors, to share in the missional prayer, to share with each other, to make sure we knew where we were by sharing in the round, so that we could be better supports to each other, so that we could be better supports to the congregation. By having those times together, we then could fulfill those roles better.
So one of the things I hear you saying is that initially, splitting that time and saying, boy, taking the time for relationships with one another, taking time to engage in a practice like dwelling in the Word,
Right.
it feels awkward because we feel like we have so many pressing things.
Yes.
Right.
Would it be fair to say now that it would be hard to envision a pastor leadership team where you didn't start by doing that?
Yeah.
Oh,
Has
sure.
that become kind of a natural now way of coming together as a pastor leadership team?
I would feel so awkward, I think, now if we went to a meeting and I didn't get to check in and see how Doug
Yeah.
was doing.
Yeah.
If I didn't get to know where he was, if we didn't get to have that
Yeah.
a centering prayer
Mhm.
or a time where we spend sharing about Scripture through dwelling in the Word,
Right.
I wouldn't feel that it was a meeting.
Mhm.
Yeah, one of the things, like in my role as support minister, is that I sensed the tension and experienced it as well, and so I helped the leadership team develop techniques for kind of adjusting the agenda and things like that. And so there are some things that now the congregational leadership team does electronically.
Mhm.
There are things that sometimes people would bring up, and you think it's just a 2-minute item, and then you end up going 15 minutes. So when someone has an agenda item, and we do the agenda ahead of time, and you categorize the things are going to be done electronically, things are just like announcements and things for discussion. And that has really helped prioritize that part of the meeting. But one of the things that I really want to add in right here is Doug Brown, who is a part of the leadership team, and he worked for, Intel, yeah. And he said, the difference between a meeting at work and a meeting in the congregation is a missional practices. Is that we just sit down and start talking business.
Mhm.
There's no difference. And he just kind of helped us remember and remind us the importance of missional practices. And really, as we listen to God, and we try to listen to God, that's what's important. Because I also remember one of the early meetings that we had, and we did the sharing in the round, we shared a scripture, and we did some dwelling in the Word, and it really brought a focus around, I think it would be like the In Poverty and Suffering Mission Initiative. And then we went into the meeting stuff, and at least for me, and I think for others, in our minds, kind of in our hearts, was what we'd been talking about. So that really influenced our conversation around the agenda items as well,
It really
which
gave
I think is appropriate.
Yeah, it really gave us that focus. And in some ways, it already answered some of our questions that we would get to an agenda item and say, oh, wait, we've already talked about this.
Right.
Yeah.
We need to now make a decision, but we've already had our discussion, and it was saturated with real deep conversation instead of the butting heads that agenda items often end up being.
Yeah, so one of the key, scripture passages we've talked about in leading congregations in mission is from 164:9d. If you would truly be community of Christ, then embody and live the concerns and passion of Christ. And it sounds like when you take the time to do that first, that it actually kind of puts everything else in its proper perspective when you're having those other conversations.
one of the I think one of the passions of Christ is right relationships.
Yeah.
And for me, and I believe for our team, the missional practices really called us and invited us to focus on relationship
Yeah.
and relationship as a team. And so when you mentioned, could you imagine a meeting without it? Frankly, no, because that relationship with our team members became such a central part to our pastoral leadership team and also our lives. And so I craved being able to engage in conversation. I realized that I loved Susan's perspective on the scriptures, that she spent, as far as our team goes, the most time in the scriptures and dwelling in the Word outside of church and outside of our meetings. So when we got to a dwelling in the Word, I was always really excited to hear Susan's perspective on the issue. So that relationship focus was really heightened and brought to the forefront with the missional practices.
Yeah. So let's also talk just for a minute about the process that's happened with the pastor leadership team. And, has this been something, how long has it taken, for you to really get to the place where you feel like, these aren't just things you're trying to do, but you've gotten to the place where you feel like, boy, this has really become a part of who we are as a pastor leadership team?
Sure. I think the first 2 meetings were definitely the ones that, they were 2.5 hours, almost 3
Almost
hours.
longer.
So those were definitely big learning experiences. I think by the 3rd and 4th meetings, we started developing some strategies, and it started to feel more natural. But I think it was probably around meeting 6 or 7 where I felt that we really hit a groove, and where it felt a lot more natural with integrating the agenda and the missional practices.
Okay.
And we tried to have a meeting about once a month. We didn't always meet the same month that we were having an LCM retreat. So
Sure.
to get 7 or 8 meetings in, that's about a year worth.
Okay.
I believe at about the year mark, when we went to a retreat again, we kind of sat down and said, wow, it's been a year, and look how far we've come.
Right.
And I remember a conversation where we looked back on those first few meetings and struggling so much. And it was really gradual change to get there, and took quite a while.
Right.
Mike, what have you seen?
Well, I just would like to reiterate that as a process, but they're really committed as a team. When you approach a congregation, say, we're going to have 7 individuals lead a congregation, a lot of people's eyebrows go up and heads start shaking. And so we had to figure that out, but they are very committed to do that. And this whole process that we've been talking about has allowed that to happen. And it's happened in a very, very positive way. And now we're into transition because Andrew and Emily are going to the Peace Corps. And so we had 2 slots, but we spent prayerful time together as a group and identified potential replacements and made the ask. And Carla's going to be one of the replacements, and Jeff Weaver another, and then we'll begin again. And I think with the core group that we have, that transition is going to be good. So it's doable, it's different, and it definitely isn't easy, but it's definitely worth it.
Yeah, so that you have really been able to model what we had hoped would happen with using pastor leadership teams, and committing to that is you're now going to go through your first transition with some changes, but you're not going to lose continuity,
Right.
because you're still going to have that pastor leadership team together. So that's really a great story. So let's talk a little bit, Carla. What have you seen on kind of the congregational side?
The main thing that I feel is different has been just a more intentional regarding the whole community congregational life. Intentional with worship, intentional with our activities that we do. And they always try to tie them in to the missional practices or the mission initiatives.
Yeah, great. Well, let's talk a little bit about the congregation as a whole. It's one thing to practice these as pastor leadership teams in a smaller group, a little bit more controlled setting, but then to begin to think, well, what does it look like to invite our congregation into these practices, and how do we do that? In a way that it doesn't feel like, we're trying to impose a program or some kind of new emphasis, but, how does it come out of the experience we've been having as a pastor leadership team. So can you share a little bit about what your experience has been with that?
Sure. Just to piggyback off one thing that Carla said, I think a really important thing for our leadership team, as well as for the congregation, is we've focused and we've been intentional in growing in our understanding of each other as well, and the different giftedness and perspectives that we bring to the issue. So one missional exercise that we participated in a congregation and a leadership team is discerning our spiritual types. And that was really helpful to frame the conversation, to have some shared language about some activities and some missional practices may really resonate with certain individuals, and others may really not be a good fit for others. And that, I think, freed the congregation and freed our team to experience different avenues and different forms of worship, different spiritual practices, and allowed us to have ability to talk to each other and to engage in relationships where we could hear, where it allowed us to engage in relationships where we could respect the differences that we all had, which I think was crucial. Foundational.
So there has been a more increased level of sensitivity.
Yes.
You think it's not just about me in worship, but
Yeah.
it's also about all of us and how we encounter God in different ways.
Right.
Well, and worship was
Yeah.
such a wonderful place, I think, to start with some missional practices. And we've been able to do some even outside of worship, in intergenerational classes, in some different activities, but specifically in worship, acknowledging that we have different needs spiritually and that we express our connection with God and we connect with God in different ways through these different spiritual types really allowed us to put different elements into worship. And so the natural extension was just to start including a couple missional practices in an occasional worship, and then in another worship, and then in another worship. And then before we knew it, it just became a part of what we were doing.
So do you feel it's been helpful to introduce the practices in kind of this mission or worship context? How's that helped, you think?
Yeah, I think that it's allowed a safe time to try something new. Our congregation has always been pretty open to trying different things in worship, and I know that some congregations aren't as comfortable in doing things differently. But for us to say, okay, now we're going to learn, we're going to try this new activity, and everyone was willing and able to do that, and it allowed us to kind of teach how to do those practices as well.
But one of the things, Ron, that I think is crucial about this is within the pastor's leadership team, they really developed a sense of the importance of the missional practices. So when they took that to the congregation, it wasn't like, oh, I read about dwelling in the Word, I think I'll do it this Sunday. I mean, there's a commitment to that, and I think that exudes out into the congregation. And so I think that was also helpful to the process.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Now, you guys have also experimented with a few other practices that are a part of LCM, not the three shared practices we talked about, but I think you've done a little bit with walking in the neighborhood, centering prayer. Could you share just a little bit about those?
Yeah, I think some of those that are maybe more different and a little less traditional, such as walking in the neighborhood, we as a pastor leadership team discussed that worship may not be the best place to introduce something like that. So we did mention it, in our announcements time before worship, that we would have a walking the neighborhood activity after a service. We started lunch and learns. So we introduced some of the less traditional missional practices outside of the worship setting. So the second Sunday of the month, we had a lunch and learn activity, which was an intergenerational Christian education class. And we did walking the neighborhood for one of those with kind of an abolish poverty and suffering lens to it, because there's a growing population of homeless in our community in the suburb outside of Portland and Tigard. And so we found that it was beneficial to use a non-worship setting to try that practice.
And it was interesting to just walk around with members of the congregation and to hear that not only had I never actually walked around in our neighborhood, but really no one in our congregation had.
Mm-hmm.
And there were people that lived a block away and neighborhoods that we didn't even know existed. Right there, right in front of us.
Yeah.
And then we were able to take that knowledge back to our later steps. Another experiment, I guess you could say, we were working on was developing our congregational story and trying to really have the congregation participate in what is it that Tuality Community of Christ is called to do. Yes, we have these programs. Yes, we have things that we are doing, but is that what we're called to do? Is that really the best use of our resources? Is that really what is needed here in this area? And without having walked the neighborhood, I don't think that later conversation would have had as much power.
Sure. If you could give some advice to our congregations out there who may be struggling a little bit with missional practices, either as a pastor leadership team or, gosh, how do we really invite people, into these missional practices? Is there anything that you would want to share as a piece of advice as a pastor leadership team that really has fully immersed yourselves in the missional practice?
I thought of one thing. I think one bit of advice would be to maybe be persistent and to be repetitive.
Okay.
I think if you try something and it doesn't really work the first time, we tend to think, oh, we better not do that one again.
Yeah.
But I was just thinking of the mission prayer. For example, we had a lunch and learn, and one of the pastorate made it into a little keychain so that we could all take that. And then she passed it out on Sunday to the people that weren't at that. And then it's been in the bulletin, and then we read it together, and then we talk about it again, and just so that I think repetition works.
Yeah.
And don't
give up if
and
it's
don't give up and try different
Right.
ways to present it.
Yeah, I think I would just say one thing that's been really important to us is to tailor it to ourselves. Like we said, we tried to do it half missional practice, half agenda. And I think once we've gotten into the flow and gotten into our own process, we really haven't focused and put so much attention on making it, 50% and 50%.
Yeah.
We feel like now that we've incorporated the spirit of it for us, it naturally happens. And if it's, happens one day only be half an hour,
Right.
great. So I think being able to personalize it and have the freedom to, make it your own experience is really important. Additionally, I would say that just to try it and give it a go and see how it works, and just the experimentation is really, really important.
I really feel that the most beautiful part of these missional practices is that it really focuses us on what matters most. If we're really trying to discern where God is calling us to go, and we instead spend all of our time on what we want and what we think is important for the congregation, then I think we're missing the mark. And so I think if we honestly, as leaders, ask ourselves if what matters most is the mission of Jesus Christ, is what God is calling us to do, then I think we have to give practices like these a try. A lot of these missional practices are not new, and they're not supposed to be complicated. They're supposed to be simple, but they're supposed to be repetitive. They're supposed to call us into deeper relationship with each other and with God. And if we can really develop that sense of where God is calling us, then how can we say no to that? So my advice would be just keep going. Just keep asking questions and find a way to make it work for you. Just because we have 7 pastors and
Right.
we've done this and this and this does not mean that every congregation needs to. I actually think the exact opposite. I think we need to really use these tools, use these practices to help discern where God is calling us to go.
We've talked about some specific ones, but on the website, which is available to all church leaders, the missionalleaders.org website, there's lists, and these might not connect, and so I would encourage to find something that does work, to be willing to take a look at that. And if you're not sure where to start, I'd start with sharing in the round. Because sharing in around, in most situations I've worked with adults, kids, and other congregations, when you start using that and talking about what's going on, most people can do that, and that becomes a really good commonplace. So those are 2 tips that I guess that I would offer.
Yeah, no, very helpful. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today and hear about some of the exciting things that are happening in the Tuality congregation. And I think one thing's for sure, the principle that mission is disruptive has certainly been a part of your journey, but has also led you to some exciting new places. And we look forward to hearing more exciting stories about what's happening in Tuality, as we also look forward to hearing more stories about what's happening in all of our LCM congregations.